Page 244. Negative and positive are two factors which are inseparably connected with each other. Consequently, there is therefore neither a negative without positive nor a positive without negative, which also goes for general physics, and is therefore not just limited to the human being's psychology or consciousness-based evolution and so forth. Just as electrical current demonstrates plus and minus, that is to say, negative and positive, the entirety of the matters of the life and the universe is also built upon the constantly cooperating factors of positive and negative. If one takes the human being's work as an example of this, then the factors negative and positive can be easily explained if, among other things, the amount of work which a human being manages to achieve is considered. The amount of work achieved is just as positive and creative as it is constructive, because a body of work is completed as a result of which something is creationally constructed or built, and so forth. But also in contrast to that, the negative aspect is that, as a result of the work done by the body, its strengths are used and become weaker, while the consciousness-based powers of concentration diminish and the exactness of the execution of work becomes inadequate and therefore destructive, because even the creational, which is contained in one's concentration, slowly diminishes. Therefore one is dependent upon the other. Thus the negative depends on the positive and vice versa. Thus in the mentioned case, the positive, therefore the amount of work, provokes the negative, being the body's powers, while the negative, the powers of the body and consciousness, provokes the positive, the amount of work, and so forth. Negative and positive are two powers which belong together and always work together and never allow themselves to be separated, because one is dependent upon the other. However, if the human being nevertheless has the audacity to separate the two factors, then an Ausartung inevitably results on one side or the other. As a consequence of this, positive or negative Ausartungen therefore arise, exactly according to which factor the human being turns towards, the negative or the positive. If the human being does not use both powers and only turns towards one of the two factors, then in this he or she falls badly out of the control of the good human nature. That is why neutral, positive, equalized thinking means that both the negative as well as the positive must be included in the thought patterns and must be tended and nurtured, however, in an equalized kind and wise, just as the term expresses it. If an idea arises in the consciousness, then this contains both negative as well as positive factors, which must be most thoroughly considered in order to create from it an ideal, an imagination, a wish, an intention, an endeavor, and therefore a Ziel. However, then contained in those is again also a negative and a positive, which together form a oneness, and together thereby lead to the fulfillment of the Ziel. The negative in the desired ideal which is to be fulfilled is, among other things, the error which must be made on the way of the striving toward the Ziel. The positive, on the other hand, is the recognition and resolution of the error, and so forth. Negative is not just negative, and positive is not just positive, because both embody factors which are evolutively necessary and may never be separated from each other, as the human being in his or her false knowledge and wrong views and so forth tends to do. If everything is to therefore go the creational natural way, then both the positive as well as the negative must be maintained, because only thereby can equalized values and successes be created. To think solely in one form or the other, solely negative or solely positive, creates a wrong understanding of the facts and consequently creates wrong, irrational thoughts, which in turn create irrational feelings and also influence the psyche in this form. Thus, a purely negatively thinking human being can become a grouch, or a murderer, or a despot, and so forth, while a purely positive thinking human being is no longer able to recognize the difference between good and bad and only sees everything through rose-colored glasses, whereby he or she is well and truly exploited and abused and deceived and so forth. The possibilities, due to a negative or positive Ausartung of the thoughts, for misconceiving reality and for behaving wrongly, and for the destructive living out of uncontrolled ideas which have not been created into ideals, are so manifold that they can barely be contemplated. A human being's purely negative thinking shows many factors which are brought to fruition by means of the might of thoughts, as unhealthy products which are expressed, for example, as guilty feelings, as hate, uncontrolled pressure, as disdain for human beings, as criminality, indifference towards life, and as cowardice and so forth. If the human being wants to free himself or herself from that, then he or she must recognize these facts and create a conscious knowledge about them in order to become consciously comprehending concerning his or her actual difficulties in this regard, difficulties which burden him or her, and from which he or she wants to free himself or herself. He or she must consciously live the knowledge which is obtained in regard to this in order to actually understand it in purely rational values, whereby he or she can first create the ability to create a conscious will in order to fight the terrible things. A deep view into one's own inner self also provides the human being with a deep view into his or her basic difficulties, which must be changed and resolved. Hidden in the basic difficulties are errors and terrible things which not only cause harm pertaining to behavior, the consciousness and feelings, as well as psychical and material harm, rather they also manifest as all-pervasive weaknesses. The individual errors and terrible things are thereby only manifestations of a big, hard, and complex hidden lump, that is to say, center, which is deeply embedded in the consciousness, and from which the individual weakness is dispatched. Therefore, in this lump, that is to say, center, of the consciousness, exist all the basic difficulties, errors, and terrible things which the human being himself or herself has innately created and continues to create in large amounts, if he or she does not change his or her ways. Altogether, the errors and terrible things form a mightful, complex factor, which, however, is divided up into units in the form of the thoughts and actions, and so forth. That means that the errors and terrible things never appear in complex form, rather only in parts of their entirety. If, for example, a complex error consists of 1,000 sub-errors, that is to say, single errors, as was already outlined in earlier explanations, then of those, only one or a few of them appear at the same time. If errors pertaining to the consciousness are made, that is to say, pertaining to the thoughts or actions, and so forth. This also applies to complex blocks of terrible things of all kinds, to which also habits, and so forth, belong. Basically, at birth, the human being has no errors, bad characteristics, and bad habits, and so forth, because, truthfully, he or she first acquires all these things in the course of his or her life. Basically, the creational natural laws determine that every single individual life form, whereby the human being is first and foremost addressed, has an absolute right to the absolute intactness of his or her consciousness, psyche, and body, and so forth, when he or she enters the material life through birth. It is only through the fault of the human being that this law of intactness is given no heed in any regard, for which reason offspring can again and again be born with all kinds of consciousness-based and physical damage and handicaps, even though the possibility of a termination of the fruit, that is to say, an artificial abortion, would exist if some kind of damage to the fetus is detected early on. However, this is only really possible at the fetal stage, given the present state of development of terrestrial medical science. It is still not possible during the embryonic period, but this will change in the distant future, after which prenatal damage will also be able to be detected earlier, and precisely during the organogenesis, during the embryonic period. Carrying out an artificial abortion is right according to creational law when significant reasons for it present themselves, one of which is that which relates to the absolute creational law of intactness, according to which every life form at birth has the right to complete healthiness in every regard. If the central complexes of errors and terrible things of all kinds are broken down in the consciousness so that they flow out and are quite consciously changed for the better in a controlled manner by the human being, then they disappear just as quickly as the conscious efforts concerning them occur. One's thinking and actions improve quickly and noticeably, so that that which negates, that which is negative and destructive in the thoughts and actions, slowly becomes positive. The might of the thoughts thereby increases, as a result of which consciously formed neutral, positive, equalized acts and deeds then come about. Once the complex lump of errors and terrible things is broken up, and once the thoughts are knowingly tended and nurtured in a healthy, evolutive, neutral, positive, equalized form, then all the refuse, in terms of errors and all terrible things, floats away from it and dissolves in the waters of life, such that the errors and terrible things become completely ineffective and undangerous. However, this happens solely by means of the might of the thoughts, if they are correctly motivated and are steered in healthy, neutral, positive, equalized forms, out of which they then also come to fruition. And the human being is in fact able to develop the might of his or her thoughts and guide them in order to use them absolutely consciously in the desired kind and wise, according to his or her own imaginations, intentions, wishes, ideals, and efforts. The human being is truly able to develop and bring forth might in order to, in every good, healthy, positive, and fair form, create everything with it which he or she needs for life and his or her conscious evolution, and in order to in fact also cope with life consciously and righteously. If the human being creates a righteous might of his or her thoughts, if he or she becomes an optimist and nurtures his or her consciousness in deep respect for life in order to also be evolutive in conscious thought patterns, in order to deal with everything in a neutral, positive, equalized, kind, and wise, then he or she confronts all life's crises and challenges creatively and constructively, in order to not only always make the best of them, rather to make the very best of them, in order to maintain himself or herself progressively in every respect of his or her life, and to let the might of his or her thoughts become ever mightier and more effective in regard to the evolution in every conceivable regard. Optimism is a state of the consciousness which is not simply given to the human being at birth. Rather, it must be achieved with great effort through the forming of one's personality and life philosophy. On the way of the achievement of optimism, there are many kinds of important points to keep in mind and to satisfy, without which an optimism cannot come about. But what essentially is to be understood by this term? For an understanding of it, let us quote Johannes Hofmeister, who in his work, quote, Wörterbuch der philosophischen Begriffe, writes the following, quote, optimism, new term from the Latin, quote, optimum, that which is best. Since the 18th century, generally those who are cheery are confident even in bad situations with everything as it is and as it comes, who are content viewing everything from the best side, prevailing mood of seeing things in a favorable light. In the terms of the language of philosophy, it is the teaching that the world is the best of all possible worlds, the belief that the historical events are a progressing realization of the ethical ideals, of the good and rational. According to Nietzsche, optimism is, quote, a sign of decline. He begins with Socrates' with theology and the belief in the God, in the knowledgeable, good human being. But with this, only one form of optimism is meant, the non-artistic, non-tragic, rationalistic. Nietzsche always castigated the usual quarrel between optimism and pessimism as the, quote, quarrel of clerics and numbskull prattle, quote, best world, quote, the fable of the bees. Once optimism is mentioned, then it is inevitable that also pessimism is spoken of, about which Johannes Hofmeister explains the following in the same work, quote, pessimism, new term, from the Latin pessium, quote, the worst, the view according to which life and the world is controlled by the bad and evil. It can be a mood, rooted in disturbances and defects of the body and soul, or note, psyche. It can also harden into the philosophical teaching. It can remain limited to individuals, but also grip entire generations and become the, quote, expression of the sickness of an era. Pessimism forms the basic characteristic of all religions of salvation, especially of Buddhism, arises in the Greek Orphism, mysticism, and fate tragedy. In Christianity, it is connected with motifs of the Old Testament, quote, all is vanity, for the purpose of devaluation of the terrestrial existence, parentheses, world as the, quote, vale of tears, and is especially sharply characterized by individual Gnostics, for example, by Marcion, for whom this world is no creation of God, rather that of the devil. Schopenhauer gave a comprehensive substantiation for pessimism. He labeled the optimism of Leibniz and Hegel, with the alleged teaching that everything real is rational, as a, quote, wicked way of thinking, by referring to how all living beings are only able to maintain themselves in this world by feeding on each other. He was followed by E. von Hartmann with the opinion that even God suffers from a blind, will-driven world development totally devoid of any glint of rational intelligence. Nietzsche replaced this hitherto existing pessimism with a, quote, pessimism of strength. Furthermore, in regard to the achievement and maintenance of optimism, it is important to say the following. Number one, it requires a special strength of consciousness, intelligence, and rationality to live in the current terrestrial world and within the gigantic mass of Earth humanity. And only he or she who acquires this strength and develops the necessary perseverance and persistence and makes them his or her own is able to create a decisive optimism from that, in which also steadfastness and endurance are anchored, as well as the will to make himself or herself even better, and the will to progress and to obtain that which is higher. Number 2. If the life and its circumstances become tough and difficult, then such a life and its circumstances must be consciously accepted and most thoroughly contemplated and processed in order to learn from it and to gain substantial knowledge, by means of which the tough and difficult circumstances and so forth are overcome and neutralized, in order to thereby gain a neutral positive equalization. Number 3. The effective facts must be constantly seen and recognized in order to avoid wrong impressions and wrong attitudes, as well as wrong views and so forth, which very quickly lead to the pessimism. Number 4. All things, circumstances, occurrences, experiences, and events of all kinds must constantly be seen and understood as such, whereby a personification relating to oneself must never result. That means that the things, circumstances, occurrences, and experiences, as well as events and so forth, must in and of themselves, in every case, be seen and understood as such, and indeed in such a way that they do not become personally burdening. Rather, for the consciousness, they always remain capable of being processed with the thoughts and impersonal. Number 5. There is no human being into whom some imaginary God has built power, because if the human being wants to have such power at his or her disposal, then he himself or she herself must in every regard achieve this with great effort. This inner power and might pertaining to the consciousness and thoughts must then, if benefit is to be gained from them and arise from them, be constantly trained, as is usually also done with the physical muscles, if they are to be developed. And it is only when the inner power and might are trained that the human being is able to thereby bring things, wishes, intentions, ideals, and imaginations, and so forth, to fruition, as a result of which he or she can develop and be creatively and constructively, as well as progressively active in his or her inner self, or in the external material realms. Number 6. If a human being is still not an optimist to the greatest extent, then, in regard to his or her consciousness, he or she must more or less thoroughly change, so that he or she can develop a real inner power by means of which his or her neutral, positive, equalized thoughts can mightfully realize everything which is evolutively tackled and undertaken. Real inner power and the might of the thoughts form a oneness through which the spiritual creational powers can be tapped and evolutively used in order to realize everything which is created from ideas into healthy positive ideals in order to obtain that which is higher. Number 7. To achieve optimism means that the mental self-image must be changed, and indeed by means of an effective and applicable self-cognition, which in turn has to be followed by a realization of self. Through self-knowledge, one's own possibility for the development of strength must be recognized in order to then actually also build up the inner consciousness-based strength by means of an inner self-realization. This strength must then be anchored in the consciousness as a positive concept, so that it is always present as effective knowledge and positively influences the thoughts in this form, whereby the positive might of the thoughts develops. Number 8. All efforts must be practiced until they are mastered. Once this state is reached, then the efforts must continue to be maintained and practiced, tended, and nurtured, because only thereby can all really realizable things allow themselves to be translated into action and be brought to fruition, and only thereby can optimism be preserved. Number 9. Optimism and conscious evolution demand a neutral, positive, equalized, progressive, creative, and constructive thinking, regardless of how dark and negative things are or appear, and how much they constitute or appear to constitute setbacks. One's outlook and consciousness, together with its thoughts, must always be directed in a forwards direction and towards that which is higher, whereby also all the possibilities for progress must be seen, recognized, and striven for. Number 10. The human being must always comprehensively know that solely by means of his or her own power and help, he or she can confront all difficulties of the life, full of courage and readiness for success, and can overcome everything solely by means of the might of the thoughts, if they correspond to a right and evolutive and positive pattern of thoughts.